Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. Hope you're doing well. My guest today is Joe Clark. Joe Clark was on the show a few weeks ago, episode 255. We talked about his book, News Parade, The American Newsreel, and the World as Spectacle. And after I pressed stop on the old Nostalgia Trap recorder, Joe and I ended up having a conversation about the state of higher education and our own paths, being guys that got PhDs several years ago at this point, and don't have full-time jobs and are working as adjunct instructors, and how we're part of this growing generation of, it must be thousands and thousands of people who are highly trained humanities scholars with nowhere really to go. And by that I mean, I used to talk about it as like a bad job market. To me, there's just like no jobs. And for me, speaking personally, and as we get into in this conversation with Joe, you know, I don't even look at jobs. There are zero jobs for me to apply to. And by that, I mean the jobs don't come up that are United States history instructors. But beyond that, you know, no one wants me. I'm many, many years out of my PhD, and I'm irrelevant. I'm a dinosaur in that market. So, you know, the balance and I think the tension and the agony of being in this position, and I know many people know it, is sort of like, what do? You know, do you give up on ever getting that university job? Because it seems like that realistically you should. But on the other hand, sort of how do you cut a path and have a career? And by that I mean, you know, make money consistently if you have a PhD in the humanities. I don't know what that path is, and Joe and I sort of brainstormed throughout this conversation, but also I think ranted and raved a little bit too, because it for those of you that know it, I know that a lot of Nostalgia Trap listeners know this world. It's a rough one, and it's a rough one to even complain about too, because you know, you're this humanities academic that in the wider culture is just not seen as someone that should be complaining at all, because there are so many other people suffering. So it's a weird path into thinking about, you know, cross-class solidarity and that sort of thing. So this was a really fun conversation for me. Joe is involved in a number of unions and organizations and has a knowledge about this situation that goes beyond me. So this was illuminating. A little bit depressing, but I think that, at least speaking for myself, finding each other and sort of growing the community and building the solidarity between people that are also on this sort of path outside the tenure track is an important part of what I'm trying to do with Nostalgia Trap. So with that in mind, if you are able to subscribe, please do. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. It's really important for us, and moving forward, especially in the COVID year with so many jobs being wiped out in the academy, to me, it's just incredibly vital to keep hold of those voices and all that work and research and knowledge that I think is lacking in the wider culture, and we're trying to bring on Nostalgia Trap. So if you can help us grow that, please do at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And thanks so much for the people that are supporting the show. We are live every Thursday on YouTube, 1 p.m. Pacific time if you want to come by. And our subscribers get that audio and video every week too. All right, enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Joe Clark. Okay, well, Joe Clark, thanks so much for coming back on the program. We had a fun time last time talking about your book, News Parade, which I think is, like we were just talking about before we started recording, a really important entry into our understanding of what these things are. It seems like newsreels have a very popular sort of understanding in the place in the imagination, but we got a lot of great responses from your episode. Listeners, I think, really enjoyed it. So thank you for coming back.
My pleasure. It's great to be back. Yeah, it was a great conversation last time. Hopefully this one will be just as fun.
Well, you know, it's not as fun a topic, or maybe, I mean, it's hard to say actually, because the reason I wanted to talk to you again is because after we stopped recording last time, I sort of, you know, we sort of chatted a little bit of shop talk about being academics in the 21st century and what that's like. And, you know, I didn't realize the depth of your sort of engagement with that. the precarious labor organization you were telling us or telling me about is part of the professional organization, right? The Society of Cinema and Media Studies. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, we founded it a couple of years ago. Well, we had our first meeting when the Society for Cinema and Media Studies met in Toronto in 2018. That first meeting wasn't organized by me at all. It was Bruce Purcell, was a member of the society, precariously employed, and also an employee of the society. And he's the one who brought us all together. And that initial organizing meeting led to a number of efforts. Now we have a designated spot on the board of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies for someone who's precariously employed. And we have this organization, sort of a caucus type organization, precarious labor organization within the SCMS to represent non-tenure track, precariously employed, alt academic, independent scholars, basically anyone who's precarious, which to be honest, these days is everyone, because as tenure track folks and tenured folks are finding out that in late capitalism, everyone's job is precarious. So.
Yeah, no, that's true, and it's funny because I wonder what it was like for you to find that out, because that was something of like the bitter experience of going to graduate school. I mean, I kind of went to graduate school in part to escape a bad economy, and feel like I could I'll just retreat into the academy, and the academy will take care of me. And then that's part of my own naivete, I think, and sort of not understanding that those elements of capitalism were in the academy too. What was that process like for you? Did you discover that in graduate school, or did you go into this knowing that it was going to be a rough road?
Oh, no. I was hopelessly naive. Yeah, no, looking back, I think about how, I think if I'd understood what the labor situation was like, I may not have started. I probably wouldn't have finished. But at the time, I was convinced, and to be honest, the only reason I was able to finish was because I didn't think about the labor market. I was very fortunate to go to a good school that had a good track record of placing people. I did American Studies at Brown University, which places lots of people. And certainly did when I went there. It had been placing people either in museum jobs or faculty jobs pretty regularly.
I was jealous of the people from Brown. They were like, "Oh, those are the people that get all the jobs." I think that's part of what's kind of amazing to hear now is that I mean, some of the most active voices that I see on this issue are like at Ivy Leagues and are like, It's interesting.
It's funny to hear people complain about people who go to Ivy Leagues and then getting the jobs, and then being one of the people who went to an Ivy League school and not getting the job. That makes me feel extra bad.
Very bitter pill. Yeah.
No, but at the time I was there, this is all before the 2008 economic crisis. So I didn't graduate until after the crisis, but I was, I was in my coursework all came before the crisis. So the advice that I got from my mentors was the most important thing you could do is finish your dissertation. And I knew that the only way to to get a job, right, rather than doing a bunch of other stuff, I should focus on my dissertation. I didn't really follow that advice, but just because I don't have the kind of single-mindedness that I think is the only way to, I mean, I have a certain amount because it's the only way to finish a PhD. But I think, I look around at my peers who got jobs, and they were far more single-minded and sensible about the choices that they made. I have too many outside interests. I'm too interdisciplinary. I'm too much of a dilettante, I think, to really be a success. But ultimately, I decided that the only way I was going to finish my dissertation is if I did the thing that really I was passionate about and that I could, see all the way through. And in the end, it's become the book, and I'm really grateful for what it's become. And now, finally, sort of 10 years after I graduated, I feel like, if I graduated today, although the market is terrible, at least my work is sort of I think has some currency. When I graduated, I don't think my work didn't have much currency. People weren't interested in newsreels at all, or they're just starting maybe. And I like to think I was ahead of my time. But no, the real reason is just that I never made the choices that, kind of careerist choices. Like I focused on finishing my dissertation, and I focused on teaching because, to be honest, I always enjoyed teaching, and that distracted me from publishing early on, late in my dissertation and early on in my, post-graduation. I didn't publish as much as I should have. But the other thing, the big thing is that now I realize that, I kicked myself for making those decisions back then. But the reality is that it's such a crapshoot that there's no individual choice that leads to a job. There are great people doing wonderful work who have landed academic jobs, but there are just as many great people doing wonderful work who have not. And
I wonder about that careerist circuit you're talking about, because I mean, part of it for me is conferences, right? I'm very near to you in terms of timing. I think I concentrated on getting my dissertation done and then publishing as a book. And that was what I was doing. That seemed like it took up all of my time and energy with teaching. And conferences were something that would seem like I just didn't have the time or energy to participate in. But now I sit here and I'm like, if I had 3 more conferences on my CV that I went to in 2013, would that have gotten me the job? Would that have been it? It seems like there are a lot of other elements than just those hitting those marks, those traditional marks.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think that we, for all of American studies and sort of the humanities left-wing posturing, we've like that narrative is such neoliberal kind of subjectivity, like building in that it's what are the things that I didn't do? Oh, I should have, that article that I put in a edited collection, I should have put that in a journal because that would have come out sooner. It would have been better on my CV. Those kinds of things. Like if that's the difference between getting a job and not getting a job, then there's a much bigger crisis.
Yeah. And all these like random hidden things like that you hear that since I was new to graduate school, in the sense of like I hate the term first gen, but that's kind of what I was. My family hadn't been around this, so I sort of had to learn all that stuff as it was happening, and to hear little like bits of like, oh, don't do biography because no one will respect you if you do biography. These little things. And I'm like sitting there like, oh, should I not do biography? And I'm like, it's actually affecting like the subject matter and the content of what I'm going to study, because I'm thinking, what decision should I make to appeal to some imaginary board or committee that's going to make a job decision? It's not the right way to go about doing scholarship, certainly.
And you'll drive yourself insane.
Yeah.
And the reality is that the market now, anyway, and has been for the last, since 2008, has cratered so much that any strategic decision you might have made, it, has so little bearing on whether you got the job or not. There's so many variables, so many hidden things that are going on with every search committee, and so many things that are impossible to predict, that I think, I applaud people who've managed to get jobs. And I know that, you have to be great to get a job, but you certainly getting a job doesn't mean, not getting a job doesn't mean you weren't a great candidate, because there are hundreds of applicants for every job.
Well, at this point, I mean, I assume there are just more and more and more, especially humanities PhDs, that don't have tenure track jobs. And we talk about it a lot on the show in terms of just speculating and imagining. I'm sure there's more data on it, but I'm sort of like, what happens? What becomes of the PhDs? Because I mean, for me, I'm still teaching. I'm still like half an academic. Like, I'm still teaching. I think of Nostalgia Trap and this work as partly academic work. And I'm in that world, but at the same time, I don't know what my next semester will be like ever, and I don't teach in the discipline that I have my PhD in either. I teach in a communication program, because I do podcasting and communication and public speaking and things like that. Yeah. So it's a really I think everyone has a different story in terms of how they survive it. But how are you doing? What is your outlook?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very fortunate. Basically, what happened is I spent 4 years as a visiting assistant professor in a couple of different liberal arts colleges in the U.S. So I was at Colby College in Maine, and then I was at Franklin and Marshall in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And at the end of 3 years at Franklin and Marshall, you can't be a visitor for longer than 3 years, right? Because then you're no longer a visitor. So they told me they wouldn't be able to hire me again. And at that point, I realized I'd spent those 4 years essentially living long distance with my partner, who for the most of that time was living in Vancouver. And, I could have applied for more jobs in the US. Probably, could have gotten another visiting position. I probably at that point didn't think I was going to get a tenure track job, but I could get another visiting position probably. And maybe once the book came out, then it would turn into possibilities for tenure track. But I just decided to make a life decision, which is that I wanted to be in Vancouver with my partner. And I thought that I'd be able to get some teaching in Vancouver. And I had worked when I was finishing up my dissertation and before I left for those VAP jobs, I'd been working in film festival work in Vancouver. And so I figured, okay, I'm going back to Vancouver. I'll see what I can get in terms of teaching and festival work, and I'm going to finish my book. And I wanted to finish my book not for, by this point, basically that was a decision to sort of leave the tenure track job market and just decide that I was going to be an academic on my own terms. And if that meant leaving academia altogether, then that's what would happen. But I wanted to live in Vancouver. I wanted to start a life, really, because I felt like I'd been, a kind of nomad for too long. And I just wanted to be in a place and, settle down. And I was very fortunate that I got hired here we call adjuncting basically a sessional instructor is the title we have for adjunct. So semester-based single class contract. I got a job teaching in the School for the Contemporary Arts at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Just one course, the first half of their film history survey. And I was fortunate that the person that I was filling in for went on sabbatical the year after. And so I got a few more courses and got a year-long contract. And just, now I have sort of I'm on for the first time in my career since graduating in 2010. I have a 2-year contract at Simon Fraser. It's only part-time. So I have 4 courses at Simon Fraser, and I teach at the University of British Columbia, and I teach at the art school in town, the Emily Carr School for Art and Design. And with all of that, now I am working essentially full-time. I have a 4-4, depending on my schedule. I have a 4-4, but split between 3 institutions.
Yeah, that sounds very, very familiar.
Yeah.
Do you have to drive around? Do you drive around?
Yeah,
before pre-COVID, obviously.
Yeah, pre-COVID. Yeah. So I have 3 institutions, but 4 campuses, because Simon Fraser has 2 campuses. They have a downtown campus where I'm normally at, and then a much distant main campus, which is an hour or so drive from where I live. But
so you're used to the world of multiple ID cards and email inboxes and sitting there and being like, what student is talking to me from what school? I mean, that splits your loyalty weirdly in the same way that the school is kind of splitting its loyalty to you. For me, I've been doing it for God. I mean, I worked at Baruch College in New York City for 14 years, and when I walked out of that building, like no one said goodbye to me. I never went to any department meetings. I was never a part of the department in any way, even though I was a pretty well-known presence among the students. I felt like nobody knew me. It's weird to sit here in like the COVID year and everything that's happening in the world and being like, well, save some pity for the graduate students, save some pity for the academics. But at the same time, I think it duplicates a really common feeling among lots of different industries, which is like feeling like it's the gig economy, this idea that like I don't really know anybody at my job, and like I just feel like I could just leave and no one would even notice. Like there's a real drag to that. Like there's a mental health element to it that is definitely present, like, and feels even
It's
more with the
yeah.
with the zooming.
Yeah, it's very, very alienating. I totally agree. And the way that, for my first couple of years, I felt that really acutely back in Vancouver. And to be honest, and I don't like the way that I combated it is I got involved a little bit with, at Simon Fraser. I got involved with, I basically just volunteered for service because it was a way to meet my colleagues, because otherwise I wasn't going to be able to introduce myself to them very easily. So I started serving on some committees, which is unpaid work essentially. I think my current contract actually says that 10% of my work is service. So that's a part-time job. So 5% of my working life is supposed to be dedicated to service. That's I probably do 3 or 4 times that, but whatever. But at Emily Carr, the way that I decided was I was going to get involved with the faculty association there, and in particular, representation for what we call their non-regular faculty within the faculty association, and a round of collective bargaining and seeing what we could do to improve the situation for non-regular faculty in that round of collective bargaining, a round of collective bargaining that was effectively canceled by the COVID pandemic. So basically it was a status quo contract. And so all of that effort that we had, which was writing language for a new collective bargaining agreement, had to be basically postponed and put towards the next round, which is coming up now in a year and a half. So
I want to hear more about sort of how this affects the discipline specifically that you're involved in, because I mean, I know it from the perspective of history, which is kind of insane. I tell older people, because I actually survive in part by teaching classes to older populations, retired people that want to hear about history and the Civil War and things like that. And when I tell them about these sorts of things and like how history is a dying discipline in the academy, and like I can't get a job and none of my friends that went to graduate school are getting jobs, and they're horrified by it, because they're all liberals, and they're like, this is why Trump is president, this is why all this terrible stuff is happening, is because we don't study history. So it seems like there's like that knowledge of it, but I wonder how it is from like American studies or film studies, cinema studies, media work. Because I mean, to me, we're big American studies fans on this show. We're like big. I mean, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar myself, and like, to me, that's where it's at. Like, that's the future of, like, that's the most vital way of thinking about the issues, the biggest issues and problems that we're facing as humans. Yet at the same time, I wonder what those disciplines are like right now, because American studies seems like it's as much in trouble as history.
Yeah, I think institutionally, I'm a little disconnected now since I've moved back to Canada, where there basically are no American studies departments in Canada. There's a few North American
that makes sense. That's funny to think about, yeah.
Well, there's Canadian studies as well, but disciplinarily, Canadian studies differs quite a bit from from American studies. It's much more of a social science. It's more of a political science. The Canadian studies historically is more political science and or literature, interestingly, but not a kind of ethnic studies approach, although that is starting to change. But
wow.
But I think that the ASA and American Studies has always been a kind of politically minded activist organization, or it has been certainly recently, and that makes it a target for right wingers and for state governments for that are downsizing public institutions. I think American studies and ethnic studies and its kind of affiliated fields are right in the crosshairs of those kinds of movements, and so there's that. But the flip side of it is that I think that there's a real activist spirit within the American Studies academia, and so a lot of contact with labor organizers, folks that are on the front lines of the immigration battle, Black Lives Matter, and things like that. And so I think that kind of activism in some ways serves the discipline well, because it first of all keeps it vibrant, right? There's a really close, I think, a lot of moving back and forth between activist communities and academia within American Studies, which makes for, I think, vibrant academic debate that's really closely connected with contemporary politics, and so gives it a vibrancy and a vitality and a kind of raison d'etre that, I mean, history is relevant, but I think there's a lot of there's a much broader ideological spectrum within history departments, right? And so there's more. There's whereas
so you're saying like American Studies is a lefty sort of discipline.
Yeah, it's lefty, but it's also it's not just intellectually left, but it's also activist left.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And I think that's a difference as well, because there's plenty of lefty historians, but tend to be, and I'm a historian as well, tend to be less activist oriented and more historical, like more, they're interested in thinking about the past and its relation to the present. But American Studies is, there's a lot of people doing work. Field work. Their field work means going to the border and embedding themselves with folks who are working with refugees, for example. Or so there's a little bit more direct relationship to the politics of the day, which doesn't save it from the knife when it comes to government cuts, but it does make it a kind of a vital place for conversation. So it makes it relevant in a way that's hard to ignore. At least that's how I feel about it.
Yeah.
Now, film studies is, I think, we're going through our own set of identity crisis, because not only do we have the problems of academia crumbling, but film itself, we're at the end of cinema. So, so that's like another layer that our, the thing that we've dedicated our lives to has become irrelevant by COVID has shut down every movie theater, and the rise of streaming has brought into question what even is our object of study. So,
and everything has been reduced to Scorsese versus Marvel, and so many complex conversations lost. I mean, it makes me think. I was in a film studies department in undergrad in UC Santa Barbara in the 90s, and I mean, I think I told you it was all Tarantino and the rise of indie cinema, and the conversation was a lot about digital and sort of wondering what was going to happen with digital and what was going to happen with celluloid and film itself, and that was the panic, and there were camps about it, It just feels like a very different conversation now, 25 years later. It's we don't really think about whether or not digital will have an impact.
It's had its impact, or it's having its impact. Yeah, I mean, and not altogether negative. I mean, digital cinema.
Right.
I work mostly on documentary, and the impact of digital filmmaking on documentary has been profound, right? Because it just means, if you're making an observational documentary in the age of celluloid, filming 100 hours of celluloid was a huge amount, but now you can have thousands of hours of digital footage, and it takes up room on a hard drive. That's all.
Yeah, it's funny.
And as a result, you get wonderful observational documentaries, because you can build all this archive of footage and then narrow it down to, cut it down to an hour and a half or whatever, and you've got this great, archive of footage to work from. So there's possibilities there.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it's funny to think about these divisions and how they don't matter, because I think we were all right in a sense. Some of us were saying that, well, there's going to be a democratizing thing and everyone will be able to make movies on their own. It's cheaper and all that sort of thing. And others were cynical and saying, no, it's all going to be controlled by corporations. And it's like, well, we're all kind of right. All those things are happening at once. And it does seem like an era of, I mean, to me, that would make the film studies discipline much more necessary in order to you know what I mean? We're in such a deep moment of transition and chaos when it comes to media. we need our media thinkers, but it's hard to communicate that.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
there has, within film studies, I think it's telling which fields have burgeoned recently.
Hmm.
Industry studies, I think, has gone from a very niche subfield to being much more of a vibrant place. Also, like media and the environment or eco cinema studies, I think are burgeoning because there's a recognition that cinema isn't just a medium, but it's also a material, and it has material effects on the world. And so there's lots of good work happening now
Yeah.
about the
Yeah.
the impact of film and media more broadly. We know sort of generally about the use of rare earth minerals in the manufacture of digital technology, but so those are being incorporated into media studies, those ideas, and thinking about the ways in which media like has these kind of material impacts on the
Mm.
world. So
Hmm.
I think it hasn't film and media studies haven't completely transformed themselves, but I think they're the places that I see growth and new exciting work are to do with also distribution studies has become, at least for historians, has become an increasingly interesting subject. The ways
Hmm.
in which not just films are made or watched, but the ways that they circulate. And that's, I think, a kind of reaction to the rise of Netflix and Amazon and other streaming platforms, which are obviously transforming distribution models. And so now we've become, as historians, my colleagues in film history are becoming more interested in what were alternative distribution models, so non-studio distribution
Mm.
models
Yeah.
for independent cinema, for educational cinema, and those kinds of things.
I
Yeah.
remember a clip of David Lynch years ago, saying like, how could you watch a movie on your fucking phone? Really upset about that notion. And he's got a Netflix series. Years later, fast forward years later, he's got a Netflix series coming out, and I think that a lot of even like the people we consider artists have kind of reconciled with the fact that like this is the medium through which you distribute and make stuff now, and for better or worse, that's where we're at.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's ways that we need to think that through.
Hmm.
It not just artistically, but again, kind of from the point of view of ecology and environment. I'm very fortunate to be one of my colleagues at SFU. Laura Marks has been organizing this small file media festival, which is in part around concern with the costs of the environmental costs of media streaming
Mm.
and the energy costs. It's exorbitant. You don't realize it, but something like 500 downloading 500 megabytes of file is like running your clothes dryer like 2 times.
Mm.
So,
Hmm.
and we download without even thinking about it, right? Where that energy cost is completely invisible, and so in part to make that visible, Laura Marks organized this small file media festival where all entrants have to be under 5 megabytes. So every film, and people find ways to reduce the file size, by reducing the frame rate, by doing simple animations, by doing 8-bit. There's all kinds of ways to do it,
Wow.
but it's really fantastic. Yeah, the first one was last year, and the second one is happening this year. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting. There are. I think opportunities as well as challenges
Yeah, I
in
mean,
the kind of contemporary media environment.
no, I mean, how much is like the experience of streaming detached from the like environmental impact? I mean, it's insane to think about. I don't think people think about like that I'm streaming something on my phone on YouTube and that there is an environmental impact to that. We've really like convinced ourselves, and it's part of the whole media world, but like there's just this cloud, and the stuff comes from the cloud. I feel like there's all these
Yeah,
words that sort of
yeah.
separate us from like what's actually happening here.
What could sound cleaner? You stream things from the cloud, right? It's all natural. It's the cycle. It's the water cycle. It's very, it all sounds very benign. But depending on where you are, right? I'm fortunate to live in British Columbia, where most of our power is hydroelectric, which has its own problems. Dams are being built unceded indigenous territory, and there are real sovereignty issues at work there. But at least the energy isn't carbon intensive. But if you're, but having said that, a lot of the servers that I might be using and downloading from are probably located in places like Virginia, which is one of the dirtiest places in the United States for its energy use, and it's where a lot of server farms are located, and they mostly use coal powered energy.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I wonder. I mean, in terms of the academy, I mean, it's weird to occupy this position, right? Because it's sort of like I feel I'm rejected by the academy ultimately, like when it comes down to it. But at the same time, I'm sort of like attached to it, and still teaching class, literally sometimes in the same campus that I've been rejected by. It's a weird, even, you're telling that story of being a visiting scholar and like being at an institution for a couple years, you do sense of like, oh, maybe I'll just be here, and then it's like, no, you won't, you'll just leave. And like that, there's something heartbreaking about that. But I mean, I wonder what in terms of like this, like political thing, like I think about like, what are the radical possibilities that can come out of the academy? I mean, you're talking about these American studies departments. And part of me is like, well, all this radical energy is then sort of sequestered into the academy where it's safe and it's not going to be a threat. That's one thought. But the other thought of mine is that like, well, if you create all these radical people and you don't give them that space, what happens to all that radical energy and thought? Because it seems like, colleges, for better or worse, have been a site of the production of radical thought and practice. Especially in like, we think of the post 60s moments. I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because it's I mean, I know it's a big question, but I think about it a lot.
I think I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish. There's lots of challenges along this road, but I think there might be some potential, right? Because I think that, part of the left politics of the academy has been, until recently, contained by the class position of the professoriate, that have been comfortably ensconced in tenure track positions without any real allegiance or affiliation with working class folks who are working for a wage and facing the real challenges of like late capitalism, right? They're being insulated from those things. Now, increasingly, the professoriate is contingently employed, have far more in common from a class perspective with the janitorial staff, and like from a labor perspective, let's say, not with the janitorial staff, the custodial staff, the cafeteria workers, and certainly the low ranking administrative staff. As a sessional instructor, I have more in common in terms of my pay, my rights as a worker, and my relationship to the administration with the secretary in the office than I do with my tenured colleague, right?
Right.
And I think the more that adjuncts and precariously employed faculty recognize that is their true class allegiance, they're much more able and likely to organize, and that then they have the historical and kind of theoretical knowledge to think about class relations, and the economy from big picture, but they also have they are part of an alienated labor force, and for a long time thoughts about how to organize the working classes centered around, well, how do we bring consciousness to the workers, right? I'm talking I'm talking
totally.
about historically, right? But what's happening now is that you're getting people who are, have a kind of historical sense of understanding of relations, and now we're getting the real life. They're getting the education, right? People with PhDs are now getting an education on what it means to be underemployed, precarious, and working in a gig economy. And so actually the education is working the opposite way. But as a result, this is very optimistic, but we might be able to form a true class coalition that that can affect change, and that it will be born out of a labor movement that it, allies PhD adjunct employees with, cafeteria workers, for example.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because it's like you have this like downwardly mobile middle class, right? Like basically like a bunch of young people who kind of sort of expected to glide into the economy that maybe their parents were in. And instead of seeing, that they're working 5 different jobs and have no health insurance and are really wondering, what's next in terms of how to survive year to year. I wonder, you're a history person, and you're a history person, and your book is within this time period, like the New Deal and everything like that. It seems like that was a period, and even the progressive period before that, where it's like when middle class people experience that, that's when you actually see change. I'm trying to be optimistic with you here too, which is that you see change when like middle class people get fucked over. And they're like, oh, we got to change the system, because they didn't get. And I wonder if that's like a cycle. And we'll see that like this sort of like middle class, we got to get back to tenure track jobs, and we got to get back to like creating that insular place that I can escape to. It's interesting because it's like it is a different moment. The New Deal, like I feel like white supremacy had a grip in a way that it doesn't quite. I know that's a weird way of putting it, but what I mean by like in the political system. Maybe, God, I have to qualify that a million different ways, I think. But I think that there's more of a diverse class of people that are within the political class. I'll put it that way.
Right.
And there's more of an awareness of what needs to be done. I feel like they wouldn't be able to do a New Deal that excludes Black workers in the same way, but maybe they would. I mean, they're definitely going to exclude certain classes of people.
Well,
that's for sure.
For example, I mean, just ripped from the headlines, the latest COVID relief bill in the U.S. I was just reading about how this offered Black farmers in particular who have faced extreme problems with debt and like a kind of spiral that has led to a lot of Black farmers having to give up their agricultural land, that this has a stimulus package specifically designed for agricultural workers, which Black farmers are going to be able to capitalize on. Contrast that with the GI Bill, for example, that basically explicitly excluded African-American agricultural workers, right? So in a very narrow sense. That's the only
point I was making. Yeah,
in a narrow sense, I think you're right. But just to get to that point about kind of like optimism, I think that we are in a kind of progressive era moment. I think back to, the future is not guaranteed because there are 2 possibilities. One is, I think you're right, is that, academics on the tenure track might entrench and say that the solution is more tenure track jobs. But, that's not a solution to the academic problem, not for untenured folks. It just will lead to more exploitation. The reality is that tenured positions, they exist because of the labor of non-tenured employees, right? Our underpaid teaching allows tenured folks and tenure track folks to take their sabbaticals, right? So, that's a real concrete way in which our class interests diverge. But I think that there's a kind of parallel. I think the parallel I would draw is to a kind of, are we going to stick with a kind of guild system, trade unions, or are we going to have an industrial union? Before I turned to film, I as an undergrad, I was passionately interested in the Wobblies and the IWW, and their goal was to organize all labor. Right. And to build an egalitarian union movement that could represent different workers, skilled and unskilled, together in the same union. And it was a rejection of a kind of trade unionism that was built loosely on an old guild system. And what we have in academia, the tenure model, is a guild system that, like an apprenticeship model that, it sort of worked, in the old days. But now the only thing sustaining it is all of this underpaid, highly skilled, but highly underpaid and undervalued labor that's being done by adjuncts. And so I think if there's a future, it's that underpaid workforce is going to recognize that its allegiance should not lie with with the tenured and tenure track people above them, but rather with their colleagues who are working in the office, who are working security, or
Mhm.
working in other jobs within the institution. And that's an industrial model. I mean, the
Yeah.
university as industry, but that's an industrial model of organizing that I think, and with graduate students and with the students as well, the undergraduate students even, because many of those are employees. But But suddenly we'll have a much bigger um, force of workers who can push back against the
Yeah.
institutions.
That's an optimistic goal. It's funny. And the reason I say that is because I was thinking, I made a move very similar to you in the sense of, I came back after years in New York City. I came back to my hometown in on the coast of California, and came here because my wife got a job and I didn't have a job at all. And when I got here, I thought sort of thought to myself, well, I have a PhD and I'll try to, put my best suit on and my briefcase and go, go hit the streets and pound the pavement and shake some hands, and it took a while, and for a while I was only teaching SAT courses for Kaplan, which is an absolute fucking nightmare of a position in every way. You talk about like dystopian. It's just there's something to that. Teaching high schoolers about standardized tests after years in the academy. But either way, I wasn't making any money doing that, and I was thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to pay rent here. And my next step was to apply for a job at like Home Depot, or Costco. Like that was my next step, and it was exactly what you're talking about. It's sort of, I was thinking to myself, wow, like for the first time in years, because I worked in restaurants and shitty jobs all through my 20s. But it would be for the first time in years that I would be back in contact and working with a population that is from a different, like, sort of position than me. And the position is unclear. Like, what do I mean by different position? It feels like a class thing, even though I'm sitting there at the same class position as they are, scraping together, a living. But at the same time, I have read all these books and I have all this knowledge. It makes me think about sort of the 60s, that when socialists were entering into working class jobs and trying to like organize there. I wonder what the possibilities are for that, because it seems like a tricky battle.
Yeah, I think that the possibilities are low if it's when it's a sort of like, well, I'm going to go slum it with in order to organize these farm workers, me, university graduate, is going to go like pick,
I'll grow my beard out a little bit. And,
go pick strawberries for a summer and organize farm workers. That's not a model for success. But what's a model for success is realizing that my daily life as a sessional instructor on 4 different campuses is much, is like an Uber driver. And, Uber drivers are organizing in California, have organized and elsewhere. And maybe what I need to do is see the reality is that this process has been happening for a long time. It's just happening to white middle class folks for the first time. Like, ask any new immigrant with a professional degree or an advanced degree from Iran or India that moves to the United States or Canada. They're working class jobs, and they do it because it was the only thing available to them. So it's just like in the last 10 or 15 years, it's been happening to white middle class.
That's why I think we're hearing about it.
Professionals, right?
Yeah.
Right. But, how many times have I gotten into a cab and talked to someone, or, cabs, but other kinds of jobs, or gone to a restaurant where the owner is like, yeah, I have an engineering degree from Bangladesh, but when I moved here, I couldn't use it. And so I opened a restaurant, right? Like, that experience has been happening for decades. But now it's happening to white dudes like us. Mm-hmm. But I think there is some kind of opportunity potentially there. For like true class alliance. I acknowledge that I'm being very optimistic, but I do think that whatever progress will happen as a result of labor organizing. And I think the places that I see success are places like in the UC system, where the graduate students, very self-consciously allied themselves with non-academic unions, because their union, didn't support them, so they
Yeah.
looked for
Yeah.
support elsewhere. And it's happening elsewhere. I know that the stuff happening at Ithaca right now,
Mm-hmm.
the union representing adjuncts there has been, making alliance with the non-academic workers at Ithaca College. So, it's in a way, I think that that realization is the path forward. Nothing is for certain. That's because there'll certainly be a whole another round of cuts coming from the reactionary forces of the right. So there's lots left to happen.
Yeah. And in California here, it's like it's Gavin Newsom and Democrats, austerity
Right.
Democrats.
Yeah. The reactionary forces of the left.
There you go. Yeah. But it makes me think about this contradiction between because I think to myself, well, what do I want? If I were given, if the society changed and there were the jobs in academia that I wanted, what would I really want? And there's kind of this contradiction between what I want for myself and then what I would want the world to be like, and I feel like everyone deals with that balance in one way or another. But I think it's really important that you're pointing out that our vision isn't like we just want a tenure track job and we just want more tenure track jobs, because it feels like the heart of the whole thing is the hierarchy and the division, the separation that you're identifying here, which is that our interests are totally different. And we have this weird, bifurcated world in the academy where there's this special class of people that get lots of money and benefits and sabbatical, and then everyone else, which is the mass of people. It's a great metaphor for American society in general. I imagine it functions similarly in Canada. I wonder about that, though. I wonder if Canada, do you see a little bit more equity or attempts at equity in Canada?
Well, we're fortunate on a few fronts, right? So although I teach on 3 different campuses, I'm in a union on all three cases. Different kinds of unions on different campuses, sometimes the faculty association, sometimes a separate union, sometimes a union that's where as an adjunct I'm with graduate students and research assistants, but other times where I'm with the rest of the faculty, and varying degrees of satisfaction with those models, I will say, but in some cases really productive relationships between tenured and non-tenured folks, or tenure track and non-tenure track folks. But the big thing that is different in Canada is, so those unions mean that I feel like I'm not exploited in the way that I know some adjuncts in the United States are working for what I consider to be I would leave. I don't blame anyone who leaves the academy when they're being paid $3,000 for a course or something like that. And I know that that's the case for some people.
I never got more than, I think, $3,200 a course.
Are you serious?
In New York City. I mean,
oh,
yeah,
Jesus.
Yeah. I mean, they're murderous wages. It's insane.
Yeah.
I normalized it, just teaching tons of classes and trying to have fellowships and do everything else. But it's intense.
And the other thing is that we have stable healthcare as a result of a public healthcare system. That means that between contracts, or and all those ways in which you lose healthcare in the United States, whether you're not working enough hours or you're unemployed or all those things, and you have to move back and forth between different kinds of healthcare models. In Canada, you have public healthcare, and that's it. And it doesn't depend on your working situation. And that is, it's not why I moved back to Canada, but it is one of the things that enabled me to take the chance on being, not having a kind of year-long contract, is because you don't have to worry about that here. So those are profound differences.
Yeah.
But in lots of other ways, it's very similar to the States. But those kind of minimum, that floor of security is,
I imagine,
it's a big difference. Yeah.
I wonder. I mean, to me, one of the biggest problems with the perception of academia, and the reason why we can't engage and can't like create solidarity with that imagined working class public somewhere is because there's this perception of elitism and separation. I feel like maybe if we're being really optimistic here, maybe smashing the tenure system is really the goal, because it's like saying it's kind of crushing that elitism. Like, to me, my wife worked at a community college, and a lot of my friends and colleagues that I went to graduate school ended up in community colleges, and it's just like, to me, like the model of an institution that's connected to the community in that way. Not that community colleges are perfect institutions; they're subject to all this neoliberal bullshit too. But either way, it feels like the elitism is sort of part of what needs to be addressed. And that's embedded in the structure of jobs.
Yeah, I think so. Because academic leadership positions, deans, and all that, they come from an elite level of tenured professor, right? Typically, and so like that elite level, which is the administration. And the kind of the top levels of the tenured university, they have very little understanding of what labor is like at the bottom, right? There are tenure track people who have worked in the precarious positions, and so know it and have colleagues in it. And anyone graduating now, even if they get a tenure track job, they know people who don't, right? So at least there's some awareness at that level. But no, I agree that that in part the tenure system is the problem. And as much as I used to want one of those jobs, and every once in a while, I admit that I do apply for a tenure job, a tenure track job, but only in Vancouver, really. But if I got a tenure track job, I would take it. But the reality is, I think that system is an obstacle to getting the things that all workers deserve, which is stability, healthcare, a living wage, right? Yeah. And we should find a way to get that for everyone working in the university. And I think, we need to either dismantle or radically change the tenure system in order to make that true for part-time workers or sessional employees or adjuncts or whatever they're called.
Yeah, and that's how you create that sort of like solidarity with the Uber driver. Is sort of where I find. I mean, I work one of my many jobs is I work at a military base, and I teach college courses to these active duty and veterans of the American military, and they're all like very working class population. Very much, they expect a square deal. They expect, because of their sort of relationship with the military, they're primed for like union membership, because they're very much about like, look, I did my work, and this is what I want back, and these are my retirement, and this is my benefits, and this is what, and I think that they have the perception that me as a professor, all that stuff, I don't engage in that world. Like, I don't worry about those things, or I don't, like, it's all taken care of. And I'm like, dude, no, like I worry about the same issues, but it's funny that we just moved, and we had an electrician in our house the other day, and this electrician guy, I was watching him work, and he was talking about the circuits in the house. He comes off to me as an absolutely like genius. The guy just knows so much about infrastructure and how it all works and circuitry, and he's talking above my level. But at the same time, he says, "Wow, so you're a professor?" And he's like, "Look at all these books, man. I can't even imagine all the stuff you know." And it was like he was sort of like performing this like, I'm so stupid and you're so smart thing. And I just hate that, because I'm like, dude, people that wrench on cars or know a lot about cars are fucking geniuses to me. And like, to me, like, if we can break that wall and see like academics as not special, but as just people who have a particular skill about research and writing, and they just, that's what they do. That to me is that there's a mysticism, and it's part of the tenure track thing too, of about what academics are, that I think is part of the barrier of connecting with that quote unquote population.
Yeah, but it's also the whole way that academia is structured is based on this mysticism, right? So we all we seek to publish in journals that don't pay us for that. Our reward is prestige and respect and acclaim, all of which is intangible. Academics have internalized a system of what we might have called like mysticism, but really is exploitation, right? It's all this unpaid labor. And like in the tenure track system, you are paid for that labor. It's part of your position. You have, time for research, time for service. And so all of your participation in this, vast unpaid economy of academia is rewarded through your tenure track contract. But now that we have, generously 50% of trained scholars in North America, for example, are not in tenure track positions. All of that unpaid labor now is just a glaring exploitation. I don't want to just plug something, but the Precarious Labor Organization, we wrote a manifesto for the Journal for Cinema and Media Studies, it became we were very generously asked by the editors. The editors are great allies of our organization, and they said, "Look, we'd like to give you the opportunity to write a kind of manifesto or something about your organization in the journal, knowing that." This is unpaid labor. And, basically we were like, thanks for the offer. And then we all said, man, this is like internally, we want to do this, but we're all busy. We all have like too many jobs. So it came, we had this kind of like really productive conversation about how we should move forward and how challenging it was going to be. And that was all during the summer. And then November came around and the deadline was looming, and the editor got back in touch and was like, if we want to get this into the next edition, we need your copy. And so we were like, oh, it's November at this point. Anyone knows, if you're teaching in November, like
right.
you're just hanging on, right?
Yep.
So there's no opportunity to put something extra on your plate. And so what we did is essentially we published our email correspondence between, these co-authors, and and we edited out some kind of like mundane personal stuff, but most of it is a transcript of our conversation of about how we both appreciate this opportunity, but also recognize that this is like exploitative labor. And the reality is that the service that we're doing, by organizing the Precarious Labor Organization, for example, is just more unpaid labor to the organization. If we succeed in what we're aiming to, which is to transform the Society for Cinema and Media Studies into an organization that doesn't just represent, tenure and tenure track researchers, but actually give something back to, non-tenured precarious scholars, then, all of the labor that went into that success will have been unpaid, which is an irony that we kind of wrestle with, right? So, it is in what issue is it in? It's in JCMS 59, number 4. That's summer 2020 issue.
We can link to it. Great.
Invite people to read it. I'm proud of it. I'm proud that we came up with this great solution, which involved no additional labor. But also, I think it makes a really good a point as well. We sort of managed to do a kind of graphic design.
Yeah, because those conversations, I love that you're just like that. The manifesto is just highlighting the agony of these conversations that I think people don't really understand are happening on the back channels. I mean, when I say I've been asked to do unpaid labor again and again and again, and it is that sort of like, you hear it from like bands now, like in music, they're like I think the hashtag is like die of exposure, this sort of thing. Right. It's like, you're being asked to perform for free because this is going to be good for you, somehow. And it's like totally, like you're saying, it's an intangible benefit. And it seems like, there is a trap in the academy of thinking that like these intangible benefits of ego, really, and of like building up your sort of brand. That's where we're all at. I mean, the end point of it is a podcast and a Patreon, I think, for a lot of people. Because then you're like, I'm special and I've got stuff to share and here it is. God, there are so many ironies to all of it and different traps. But God, Joe Clark, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. I hope I didn't spoil any opportunity of being employed in the future by my ranting around.
Absolutely not. I think this conversation is well known, and in fact, we had a few of our regular guests, Dan Bessner and Mike Brennis, are historians that wrote a piece called a moral stain on the profession. They wrote a real polemic aimed at the AHA, the American Historical Association, and there was quite a bit of response. And I think these issues and the anger and bitterness within them are well documented in the Academy. I think that's part of the growing sort of impossibility of the conversation is just kind of like you can't avoid it at this point.
Yeah.
But I really appreciate you coming back. I'm glad we got an opportunity to talk about this stuff because last time we didn't. And it's such a critical part of like knowing about a scholar, I think, is knowing that in their emails, they're worrying about doing free work and how they're going to make it in the next semester. And I think more and more people need to know that, whether they're academics or not.
100%. And I know that you found me because of that list in Contingent Magazine, and it's worth pointing out, like, support Contingent academics by reading their work, because mostly we did it it's volunteer labor almost entirely, right? I got
it's an act of love.
Yeah. I got a $100 royalty check from my press. And it was, to be honest, it was more than I expected. I didn't read my contract very well, but I wasn't reading it. When I was reading it, I wasn't worried about what I was going to get as royalties because I didn't expect to get anything as royalties.
That's amazing, though. Like my mom was like, "Oh, you have a book, and it's listed on Barnes and Noble and Amazon. How much money are you making? And I'm like, I think they might send me like $75 at some point." Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly the barrier we're talking about. Like people think, oh, you're a professor with a book. You must be a rich man, like in the movies with like a mansion full of books and that kind of thing. It's like, no, I don't know how I'm going to pay for my apartment.
3 or 4 more of those checks, and I might be able to cover my image clearance costs that went into the book.
Right? Oh God.
Maybe then the book will break even in that one little way.
Jesus.
But I just think that those things like Contingent Magazine and the more that we make it visible to people inside the profession and outside, that there are people that there's very different classes of people doing scholarship. Then that's part of the process of change as well, is just making ourselves visible. So, I'm very grateful for your podcast because it does that work as well. So,
thank you, and I think I hope that others join. That's my hope, is that we just like overwhelm the world with our skill and research and scholarship, and then we become the mainstream, and then kick everybody else out, and the cycle continues. But this is really fun. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks a lot.
All right, I want to thank my guest, Joe Clark. I'm so glad that we got to sit down and have this conversation. It is a difficult one, but one I think we need to figure out our way through. And if you have ideas, let me know. You know where to find me. But if you want to support our show, please do so. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We really appreciate our subscribers, and we will talk to everyone very soon. All right, take care. Bye-bye.